The wind in Wyoming didn't whisper. It screamed. It tore across the open plains like a living thing, hungry and relentless, biting through wool and leather and flesh until it found bone. The kind of cold that made a person forget what warmth felt like. The kind of cold that killed. Margaret Chen stood alone on the side of the dirt road watching the mail coach disappear into the white fury of the blizzard. The driver hadn't even looked back. He'd simply pointed at her carpetbag now lying in the snow at her feet and said 4 words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "Can't take no Chinaman." Then he'd snapped the reins and the horses had lurched forward, and within 30 seconds the coach was nothing but a ghost in the storm. Gone, as if it had never existed at all. Margaret stood there for a long moment, the wind whipping her dark hair across her face, snow gathering on her shoulders like a burial shroud. She should have been terrified, she should have been crying, but Margaret Chen had stopped crying 8 months ago, the day Victor Aldrich had locked her in the sanatorium and told her she would never see daylight again. She had survived that. She could survive this. She picked up her bag. It was pitifully light. Everything she owned in the world fit inside one piece of worn carpet and leather. 3 dresses, a hairbrush, a bar of soap wrapped in brown paper, and hidden in the false bottom sewn into the lining with thread she'd pulled from her own petticoat, 8 pages that could bring down an empire. But none of that mattered if she froze to death in the next hour. Margaret looked around, trying to orient herself. The driver had said Medicine Bow was 2 miles north. She'd seen the smoke from the town's chimneys just before the storm had rolled in like a white wall. If she could just find the road, follow it straight, keep moving, keep her blood flowing, maybe she could make it. She took 1 step, then another. The wind pushed back as if testing her resolve. Her boots sank 6 inches into fresh powder. Already her toes were going numb. She had 23 cents in her pocket, 2 apples in her bag, both bruised, and a letter of contract with a man named Cole Brennan, a stranger who had agreed to marry someone named Mary Sullivan. Mary Sullivan was dead. Had been for 3 months buried in a pauper's grave outside San Francisco after succumbing to consumption. Margaret had stolen her identity the way a drowning woman steals air. Desperate, necessary, wrong in every way that mattered, except the one way that counted. It had kept her alive. The snow was coming down harder now, thick flakes that obscured everything beyond 10 feet. Margaret couldn't see the road anymore, couldn't see the town, couldn't see anything but white and more white, and the dark shapes of distant trees that might have been trees or might have been her imagination. She kept walking. 1 foot in front of the other, it was all she knew how to do anymore. Survive the next minute, then the next, then the next. Her mother had taught her that. Mei Lin Chen had crossed an ocean at 16 with nothing but the clothes on her back and a jade bracelet she'd sold within a week to pay for food. She'd married an Irish dock worker named Patrick Sullivan, who'd loved her despite the law, despite the stairs, despite everything. And when they'd both died within 6 months of each other, one from fever and one from a broken heart, they'd left Margaret with 2 gifts: a head for numbers that could calculate compound interest faster than any banker in San Francisco, and a stubbornness that refused to accept death until death came and took her by force. The wind knocked her sideways. Margaret stumbled, caught herself, kept moving. She couldn't feel her hands anymore. The cold had stolen the sensation from her fingers, from her face. She touched her cheek and felt nothing. It was like touching a stranger's skin. How long had she been walking? Minutes. 20. The world had become a blur of white noise and white landscape, and the terrible certainty that she was going to die out here alone, and no one would ever know what had happened to Margaret Chen. Victor would win after all. That thought made her angrier than the cold. Victor Aldrich, with his silver hair and his expensive suits and his smile that never reached his eyes. The man who had killed her employer married her to control her and spent 8 months trying to break her mind because she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to see. She still remembered the night it had happened. Working late at the law office, copying contracts as she always did, her pen moving across the pages in neat, precise columns. Lawyer Whitmore had been in his private office with the door closed. She'd heard voices, shouting. Then a sound like a branch breaking, except it wasn't a branch. She'd hidden in the storage closet, her hand pressed over her mouth to muffle her breathing, and watched through the crack in the door as Victor Aldrich and 2 other men dragged Whitmore's body out of the office. The old lawyer's neck had been bent at an angle that necks weren't meant to bend, and the next morning the newspaper had reported that Jonathan Whitmore, respected attorney, had suffered a fatal fall down the stairs of his own home. Margaret had known better. She'd gone back to the office that night, picked the lock on Whitmore's private files, and found what she was looking for. 40 contracts, 40 families in Colorado and Wyoming who had supposedly sold their land to Central Pacific Railroad for fair market value. Except the signatures were forged, the dates were backdated, and the notary seals belonged to judges who had received payments of $500 each to look the other way. Margaret had taken the contracts to the one person she thought she could trust, a federal marshal named Davis who had a reputation for honesty. 3 days later, Marshal Davis was dead. Heart attack, the coroner said. And Victor Aldrich had shown up at Margaret's boarding house with a marriage license and a doctor's certificate declaring her mentally unfit to live independently. "You have 2 choices," Victor had said, his voice pleasant, almost kind. "Marry me or spend the rest of your life in an asylum. Your choice, my dear." She'd chosen the asylum. Better to be locked up and keep her mind than to become his wife and lose her soul. But Victor hadn't sent her to a real asylum. He'd sent her to a private facility in the mountains, a place where rich men sent their inconvenient wives and daughters, a place where the doctors asked no questions and the nurses looked the other way when patients screamed in the night. For 8 months, Margaret had endured the cold baths, the forced medications, the constant examinations by Dr. Webb, who would stand too close and breathe his tobacco breath in her face and ask her again and again if she was ready to confess that the contracts were figments of her delusional mind. She never confessed, never broke, not even when they locked her in the dark room for 3 days with no food and only a cup of water, because Margaret Chen knew what Victor didn't. She'd memorized every contract, every name, every forged signature, every payment. She'd spent 3 years working for Jonathan Whitmore, learning the law, learning how powerful men hid their crimes in paperwork and fine print. And the night before they'd taken her to the asylum, she'd gone back to Whitmore's office one last time and photographed 8 pages. Just 8. The most damning evidence. The proof that would destroy not just Victor, but the entire network of corrupt judges and railroad executives who were stealing the West from under the feet of the people who'd built it. Those 8 pages were in her bag right now, hidden where no one would think to look, if she lived long enough to use them. Margaret's foot hit something solid. She looked down, confused. It was a fence post, wooden, half buried in snow, but definitely man-made, which meant she was close. Close to something. She followed the fence line, her hands so numb she could barely grip the wood. The wind was a constant roar now, a sound that seemed to come from inside her own head. Her vision was starting to blur. She knew what that meant. Hypothermia. The body's desperate attempt to conserve heat by shutting down everything that wasn't essential. Soon her legs would stop working. Then her heart. Then nothing. She stumbled again, fell this time, her knees sinking into the snow. The cold was almost comfortable now. That was the danger. When the cold stopped hurting, when it started to feel warm, that was when death was close. Margaret closed her eyes, just for a moment, just to rest. "Over here. Follow my voice." The words cut through the wind like a knife. Margaret's eyes snapped open. She looked up, squinting against the snow, and saw a figure, tall, dark, moving toward her with the steady confidence of someone who knew this land, this weather, this cold. "Can you stand?" The voice was deep, rough, like gravel in a tin can. Male, American. Not Victor, not one of his men. Margaret tried to speak, but her jaw wouldn't work properly. The cold had locked it shut. The figure knelt beside her. She could see him now, or at least the shape of him. A heavy coat, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a scarf wrapped around the lower half of his face, and eyes. Blue eyes visible above the scarf, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "You're the mail order bride," he said. It wasn't a question. Margaret managed a nod. "Thought so. Driver came through Medicine Bow an hour ago. Said he'd left a Chinese woman on the road. Said it wasn't his problem what happened to her after that." The man stood, and before Margaret could protest, he bent down and lifted her. Just picked her up as if she weighed nothing at all, one arm under her knees and one behind her back. She tried to struggle, tried to pull away, but her body wouldn't cooperate. "Don't fight," he said. "You've got maybe 20 minutes before the cold takes you. Maybe less. Save your strength." He started walking, moving with a steady, purposeful stride that suggested he could carry her for miles without stopping. Margaret let her head fall against his chest. She could feel the warmth of him even through the layers of coat and wool. It was the first warmth she'd felt in hours. "My bag?" she managed to whisper. "Please?" He stopped, looked back, then shifted her weight to one arm and bent to scoop up the carpetbag with his free hand. The motion was so smooth, so effortless, that Margaret realized this man was strong in a way city men weren't. This was someone who worked with his hands, who lived by his body's strength. "Got it," he said. "Now hold on." They moved through the storm. Margaret lost track of time. Everything became a blur of white and cold and the steady rhythm of the man's footsteps. She closed her eyes and let herself drift, trusting this stranger in a way she hadn't trusted anyone since her parents died. When she opened her eyes again, everything had changed. She was inside, warm, or at least warmer. The sound of the wind was muted, distant. She could hear the crackle of a fire. "Can you hear me?" Margaret blinked. The man was kneeling beside her. He'd removed his scarf and hat, and she could see his face now. 30-something, strong jaw, weathered skin, a scar across his chin that looked like it had come from a knife or maybe a piece of shrapnel. His hair was dark cut short, military style. His gaze rested on her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or calculation. "You need to get out of those clothes," he said. "They're wet. You'll freeze even in here if you don't change." Margaret's brain was starting to work again, thoughts forming slowly like ice melting. She was in some kind of workshop. She could see tools on the walls, an anvil in the corner, a forge currently cold but radiating residual heat. This was a blacksmith's shop. "I'm Cole Brennan," the man said. "You're Mary Sullivan, or at least that's the name on the contract I signed." Margaret opened her mouth to correct him, then stopped. Mary Sullivan. Yes. That was who she was supposed to be. She couldn't slip up now, not when she'd come this far. "Yes," she managed. Her voice came out as a croak. "Mary." Cole studied her for a long moment, then stood and walked to a trunk against the wall. He pulled out what looked like a heavy wool blanket and a man's shirt. "I don't have women's clothes," he said. "This will have to do. There's a partition over there. You can change behind it. I'll turn around." He did turn around his back to her, giving her privacy. Margaret tried to stand and found that her legs were shaking. Everything was shaking. She managed to get to her feet, clutching the wall for support, and stumbled behind the partition Cole had indicated. Getting out of her wet clothes was one of the hardest things she'd ever done. Her fingers wouldn't work properly. She fumbled with buttons and laces, her hands clumsy and numb. Finally, she gave up on doing it properly and simply tore the dress off, buttons scattering across the floor. She wrapped herself in the blanket. It smelled like horses and smoke and something else she couldn't identify, something masculine and clean. She pulled on the shirt over the blanket, her movements slow and awkward. When she emerged from behind the partition, Cole was adding wood to the forge. He'd lit it, and orange flames were beginning to lick up from the coals. The heat hit her like a physical thing, almost painful after the cold. "Sit here," Cole said, gesturing to a stool near the forge. "Let the heat work into you slowly. Too fast and you'll shock your system." Margaret sat. Now that she was warming up, the shaking was getting worse. Her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely keep her jaw closed. Cole disappeared for a moment and returned with a cup. "Tea," he said. "Strong and sweet. Drink it slow." She took the cup with both hands, needing both to keep from dropping it. The tea was hot enough to burn, but she didn't care. She sipped it carefully, feeling the warmth spread down her throat and into her chest. Cole sat down on a bench across from her, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped together. His gaze rested on her with that same unreadable intensity. "The driver said you were Chinese," he said finally. "That part's true, at least." Margaret nodded. There was no point denying it. Her features made it obvious. The dark hair. The shape of her eyes. the skin tone that marked her as different in a country that had passed laws specifically to keep people like her out. The Chinese Exclusion Act is still in effect, Cole continued. Been law for 6 years now. Makes it illegal for Chinese laborers to enter the country. Of course, you're already here, so that doesn't apply. And the contract says you're Irish on your father's side. Mary Sullivan. That name's Irish as they come. He was testing her. Margaret realized it with a cold clarity that cut through the fog in her brain. He was testing to see if she'd lie to him. My mother was Chinese, Margaret said quietly. My father was Irish. They met in San Francisco, married in secret because the law said they couldn't. I'm what they call a half-breed, not Chinese enough for the Chinese community, not white enough for anyone else. It was the truth, or at least most of the truth. The name was a lie. Everything else was real. Cole nodded slowly. Fair enough. I've got no quarrel with what blood runs in your veins. My concern is whether you can do the work. What work? Margaret asked. Her voice was stronger now. The tea was helping. The contract said you'd keep house, cook, clean, mend clothes, help with the ranch work when needed. In exchange, you get room board and legal protection as my wife. Cole's expression didn't change. That was the deal. Question is, can you actually do any of that? Margaret looked at him directly, meeting his blue eyes with her dark ones. This was the moment. She could lie, pretend to be the dutiful mail-order bride who could cook and sew and keep a house. Or she could tell the truth and risk everything. No, she said. I can't cook. I can barely sew. I've never kept house in my life. Cole's eyebrows went up slightly. Then what exactly can you do, Miss Sullivan? I can read, Margaret said, and write. And I can do mathematics faster in my head than most men can do with pencil and paper. I worked for a lawyer in San Francisco for 3 years. I know contract law. I know how to keep books. I know how to find the truth in documents when people are trying to hide it. She paused, then added, and my real name isn't Mary Sullivan. It's Margaret Chen. Mary Sullivan died 3 months ago. I took her name because I was running from a man who wants me dead. The silence that followed was so complete Margaret could hear the wind outside and the crackle of the forge and her own heartbeat thudding in her ears. Cole didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there processing what she'd told him. Finally, he spoke. You just told a complete stranger that you're using a false identity and running from someone who wants to kill you. That's either the stupidest thing I've ever heard, or you're betting that I'm the kind of man who won't turn you in. I'm betting on the second, Margaret said. I've gotten good at reading people. Had to be. And you didn't leave me to freeze in that storm. The driver told you I was Chinese and you came looking anyway? That tells me something about who you are. Cole leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Who's the man? Victor Aldrich. He owns half the railroad contracts in Colorado. He killed my employer because my employer found out about fraud. I witnessed it. I have evidence. Evidence he'd kill to keep hidden. And you thought coming to Wyoming as a mail-order bride was the solution to that problem. I thought disappearing was the solution. Becoming someone else. Going somewhere he'd never think to look. Margaret set down the teacup. Her hands were steadier now. I didn't count on the coach driver being a bigot who'd leave me to die. Most folks out here are bigots about something, Cole said flatly. That's just the reality. You being half Chinese is going to cause problems in Medicine Bow. Not with everyone, but with enough people to make life difficult. I know. And if this Victor Aldrich is as powerful as you say, he'll have people looking for you. Probably already does. Coming here might have just put a target on this town. I know that too. Cole stood up, walked to the forge, and stared into the flames for a long moment. When he turned back, his face was set in hard lines. I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly. Can you do that? Margaret nodded. Are you willing to work real work, I mean? Not housekeeping, since you can't do that. But work with your hands. Learn blacksmithing. Help me with the books. Do whatever needs doing to earn your place here. Yes. And are you willing to be my wife on paper legal marriage, filed with the county all proper and official? Because if we're married, Wyoming law protects you as my spouse. Makes it harder for someone to just take you, but it also means you're bound to me at least in the eyes of the law. Margaret's throat tightened. This was it. The moment that would determine everything. I'm willing, she said. But I need you to understand something, Mr. Brennan. I won't be a real wife. I can't. Not after everything I've been through. I need protection, and I need a place to hide, but I can't give you what a husband would normally expect from a marriage." "I'm not asking for that," Cole said quietly. "My wife died 3 years ago in childbirth, her and the baby both. I'm not looking for love or companionship or any of that. I need someone to help me keep this place running. The bank's been breathing down my neck about a loan. They look more favorably on married men. Figure married men are more stable, less likely to run off." He crossed his arms. "So here's my proposal. You and me, we make this a business arrangement. I give you protection and a legal name. You help me keep my books in order and keep the bank off my back. We're partners, not husband and wife in the traditional sense. We work together to keep this place going. That fair?" Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. Relief, maybe, or hope. This man was offering her exactly what she needed. Safety without strings, protection without demands. "That's fair," she said. "Good. Then we've got a deal." Cole held out his hand. Margaret stood and shook it. His hand was rough with calluses warm from the fire, and when he gripped her hand, he was careful not to squeeze too hard. Respectful. Professional. "Welcome to Medicine Bow, Margaret Chen," he said. "Or should I say, Mrs. Cole Brennan." The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of someone knocking on the door of the forge. She sat up disoriented, wrapped in the blanket on a cot that Cole had set up for her in the corner of the workshop. The storm had passed. Weak winter sunlight was filtering through the cracks in the walls. Cole was already up-dressed, feeding the forge. He glanced at her, then walked to the door and opened it. A woman stood outside. She was in her 60s, gray-haired, with a face that had seen hard years but hadn't lost its kindness. She wore a heavy shawl and carried a basket covered with a cloth. "Morning, Cole," the woman said. Her eyes shifted to Margaret, taking in the scene. The cot, the blanket, the fact that Margaret was clearly wearing one of Cole's shirts. "I heard you found the mail-order bride. Wanted to bring by some breakfast and see if she needed anything." "Morning, Ida," Cole said. "This is Mary. Mary, this is Ida Henderson. She runs the boarding house in town. Best cook in Medicine Bow." Ida stepped inside, her sharp eyes still on Margaret. "Mary Sullivan, is it?" "That's what the contract said." Margaret stood, pulling the blanket tighter around herself. "Yes, ma'am." "You don't look much like a Mary Sullivan to me," Ida said bluntly. "You look Chinese." "Half Chinese," Margaret corrected. "My mother was from Guangdong. My father was Irish." Ida studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. Lord knows love doesn't care much about what the law thinks is proper." She set the basket down on the workbench. "I brought eggs, bread, and some jam. Figured you two hadn't had a proper breakfast yet." "Thank you," Cole said. "That's kind of you." "Kind nothing. I'm curious." Ida turned back to Margaret. "You know what you've gotten yourself into? Girl, Medicine Bow isn't San Francisco or Denver or any big city. We've got maybe 200 people here, most of them good folks, but some of them are going to have a problem with you just based on what they see when they look at your face." "I understand," Margaret said. "Do you?" "Because understanding and living it are two different things." Ida's voice wasn't unkind, but it was firm. "I've been here 30 years, seen plenty of mail-order brides come through. Some make it, some don't. The ones who make it are the ones who can work hard and keep their heads down and not cause trouble. I can do that." "Can you cook?" Margaret hesitated. "No, ma'am." "So?" "Not well." "Clean?" "I've never had to." Ida's eyebrows went up. She looked at Cole. "What exactly is she going to do then?" "Books," Cole said. "She's going to help me with the accounts and the paperwork. The business side of things." "Books." Ida's tone was skeptical. "You know how the town's going to react to that a Chinese woman doing the thinking work while the white man does the physical labor. They'll eat her alive." "Then they'll have to go through me first," Cole said flatly. Ida studied him, then shook her head. "You always were too stubborn for your own good, Cole Brennan. Your father was the same way, took in that Shoshone boy when everyone said it would bring trouble. And look what happened." "Running Deer is my best friend and the best tracker in Wyoming," Cole said. "What happened was, I gained a brother. Town got over it. Town got over it because your father was respected. You're still building that respect," Ida sighed. "But I suppose that's your business. I just came to make sure the girl hadn't frozen to death." "I'm fine," Margaret said. "Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Henderson." "It's Ida. We don't stand on ceremony out here." The older woman picked up the basket and handed it to Margaret. "There's a dress in there, too. One of mine from when I was younger. Should fit you well enough. Can't have you walking around in men's clothes. People already have enough to gossip about." Margaret took the basket. "Thank you, Ida. I appreciate it." "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you see how this town treats you. Then decide if my help is worth anything." Ida pulled her shawl tighter. "I'll be going. Cole, you bring her by the boarding house later. She should meet some of the women. Get oriented." After Ida left, Cole unpacked the basket. There were 6 eggs, a loaf of bread still warm from the oven, and a jar of strawberry preserves. And underneath, wrapped in brown paper, a simple gray dress with black buttons. "Put that on," Cole said. "Then eat. We've got work to do." "What kind of work?" Margaret asked. Cole walked to a desk in the corner and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. He dropped it on the workbench with a heavy thud. Dust puffed up from the pages. "I need to know exactly how much money I owe and how much is owed to me," he said. "The bank gave me a loan 3 years ago, $850. I've been paying it back, but I'm not sure the math is right. And I've got customers who owe me for work I did 6 months ago, a year ago, some even longer. I can't keep track of it all." He opened the ledger. The pages were a mess. Numbers scrawled in different hands, some in pencil, some in ink, crossed out entries. Margins filled with notes that made no sense. It was chaos. Margaret felt something stir in her chest, something that felt almost like excitement. This was something she could do. This was something she was good at. She sat down at the workbench, pulled the ledger toward her, and began to read. 3 hours later, Margaret looked up from the ledger. Her eyes were tired, but her mind was sharp and clear. Cole was working the forge, hammering a piece of hot iron into shape for a horseshoe. The rhythmic clang of metal on metal had become a kind of background music. "You owe the bank $740, Margaret said. "Not $850. They've been calculating interest wrong. They charged you compound interest instead of simple interest. You've overpaid by $110. Cole stopped mid-swing. He set down the hammer and walked over, wiping sweat from his forehead. "What?" Margaret turned the ledger around and pointed to the numbers. "See here. This is what you borrowed. This is what you've paid. And this is what they're charging you in interest. But the loan contract says simple interest at 6% per year. They've been charging you as if the interest compounds monthly. That's not what you agreed to." Cole stared at the numbers. "Can you prove that if you have the original loan contract, yes?" He went to the desk, rummaged through a drawer, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Margaret took it, read through it carefully, then nodded. "It's right here. Section 3, paragraph 2. Simple interest, 6% annually calculated on the principal balance." She looked up at him. "The bank owes you money, Mr. Brennan." Cole let out a long breath. "I'll be damned." "There's more," Margaret said. She pulled out a piece of paper where she'd been making notes. "You have 12 customers who owe you money. Total amount, $340. Some of these debts are over a year old. If you collect even half of that, you could pay off the bank completely and have money left over." Cole sat down on the bench, looking stunned. "I knew some people owed me, didn't realize it was that much." "Most of them probably forgot," Margaret said. "Or they're hoping you forgot. Either way, it's your money. You have a right to collect it." "How do you know all this?" Cole asked. "You said you worked for a lawyer, but this is more than just filing papers. You actually understand this stuff." Margaret hesitated. She'd already told him about the false name and Victor. How much more should she trust him with, "My mother taught me to count when I was 4, she said finally. "In Chinese and English, both. By the time I was 8, I could balance the books for my father's shop faster than he could. When I was 16, I started working for Mr. Whitmore. He saw that I had a gift for numbers and contracts. He taught me how to read legal documents, how to spot fraud, how to trace money through complicated transactions." She looked down at the ledger. "I'm good at this, Mr. Brennan. It's the one thing I know I can do better than almost anyone. And if I'm going to be your wife, even just on paper, then I'm going to make sure you don't get cheated by banks or customers or anyone else." And Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and held out his hand again. Partners, he said. Margaret shook it. Partners. That afternoon they walked into Medicine Bow together. The town was small, just a main street with a dozen buildings clustered around it. A general store, a saloon, Ida's boarding house, a church, the bank. People stared as they passed. Margaret could feel their eyes on her, could hear the whispers starting. She kept her head up and her expression neutral. She'd dealt with stares before. The key was not to react, not to give them the satisfaction. Cole led her to the bank. It was a small building with painted letters on the window. Medicine Bow Savings and Loan. Inside, a thin man with spectacles sat behind a desk. "Cole," the man said, standing. "What brings you in?" "Need to talk about my loan, Mr. Patterson," Cole said. "This is my wife, Mary. She's been looking at my books, Mr." Patterson's eyes flickered to Margaret, taking in her features, her dress, the fact that she was clearly not white. His expression didn't change, but Margaret saw the calculation behind his eyes. "Your wife," he said carefully. "I see. Congratulations on your marriage." "Thank you," Cole said. "Now about that loan. My wife found an error in the interest calculation." Patterson's expression hardened. "I assure you, Mr. Brennan, this bank does not make errors." "Then you won't mind reviewing the contract," Margaret said quietly. She pulled the folded loan agreement from her pocket and laid it on Patterson's desk. Section 3, Paragraph 2 specifies simple interest at 6% annually. Your records show compound interest calculated monthly. That's a different rate entirely. Patterson picked up the contract. His face went pale as he read. "This is simply a misunderstanding," he said. "I'm sure we can resolve this." "We can," Margaret said. "You can recalculate Mr. Brennan's debt using the correct interest rate and refund him the difference, which comes to $110. Patterson looked from the contract to Margaret to Cole. "I'll need to verify this with the bank's main office in Cheyenne." "You do that," Cole said. "We'll wait." They didn't wait in the bank. They waited in the saloon across the street where Cole bought 2 cups of coffee and they sat at a corner table while the afternoon light faded outside. "That was impressive," Cole said. "The way you handled Patterson." "He was trying to cheat you," Margaret said. "Men like that count on people not understanding contracts. They use complicated language and hidden clauses to steal money legally. Is that what your Victor Aldrich did? Steal legally?" Margaret nodded. "He bought judges, forged signatures, made it all look legitimate on paper, but underneath it was theft. 40 families lost their land because of him. Some of them fought back. Most of them ended up dead or disappeared. And you have proof of this." 8 pages, Margaret said, "hidden in the bottom of my bag. Photographs of the original contracts showing the forgeries and the payment records to the judges." Cole took a sip of his coffee. "If that's true, you're sitting on evidence that could hang a dozen men, maybe more." "I know." "So why haven't you gone to the authorities?" "Because the authorities are bought," Margaret said bitterly. "I tried. I went to a federal marshal. He died 3 days later. Heart attack, they said, except he was 35 years old and healthy as a horse." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup, needing the warmth. "Victor has reach, money, power. The only way to stop him is to get evidence in front of someone who can't be bought. A federal judge, maybe. Or a newspaper in a city big enough that he can't control all of them." "That's a big maybe," Cole observed. "I know, that's why I ran. I figured if I could disappear long enough, maybe he'd give up. Maybe he'd think I destroyed the evidence, or lost it, or died." "Men like that don't give up," Cole said. "They can't afford to, not when there's evidence that could destroy them." Margaret looked at him. "You sound like you have experience with men like that." "I was in the cavalry during the Indian Wars," Cole said. "Saw plenty of officers who cared more about their careers than about doing what was right. Some of them got good men killed because they were too proud to admit they were wrong. I learned to recognize that kind of man, the kind who'll burn the world down rather than face consequences." He set down his coffee cup. "If Victor Aldrich is that kind of man, and I suspect he is, then he's going to keep looking for you. And eventually he's going to find you. Question is, what do we do when that happens?" "We," Margaret repeated. "You're my wife now," Cole said. "Legal and binding. That means your problems are my problems. And I don't run from problems." Before Margaret could respond, the door to the saloon opened and a man walked in. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat and a badge pinned to his vest. His eyes swept the room and landed on Margaret and Cole. He walked over to their table. "You must be the Chinaman the coach driver mentioned," he said to Margaret. His voice was flat professional. "I'm Sheriff Blake Stone. I need to have a word with you." Margaret felt her blood turn to ice. Blake Stone. Victor's man. The corrupt lawman who'd been paid to look the other way when good people died. He'd found her. Already. Cole stood slowly, placing himself between Margaret and the sheriff. "My wife and I were just having coffee, Sheriff." "Is there a problem?" Stone's eyes flickered to Cole, assessing. "That depends. I got a telegram this morning from Colorado. Says there's a woman named Margaret Chen wanted for escaping from a mental institution. Dangerous, mentally unstable. Reward of $600 for her safe return." He pulled a folded poster from his coat and laid it on the table. Margaret's face stared back at her. The photograph was old from before Victor, but it was unmistakably her. "Now, I don't know if you're Margaret Chen," Stone continued, "but you sure do look like her. So I'm going to need you to come with me to the sheriff's office, just to answer some questions. Make sure everything's on the up and up." Margaret's mind was racing. If she went with him, she was dead. Stone would hand her over to Victor, and that would be the end. But if she ran, she'd be confirming that she was the woman they were looking for. Cole looked at the poster, then at Stone. When he spoke, his voice was calm but carried an edge like a blade. "This poster says Margaret Chen. My wife's name is Mary Brennan née Sullivan. She's got a marriage certificate filed with the county as of this morning. You can check the records if you want." Stone smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Marriage certificates can be forged. Names can be changed. I'm just doing my job, Mr. Brennan, making sure we don't have a fugitive hiding in Medicine Bow." "She's not a fugitive," Cole said. "She's my wife, and under Wyoming law, a married woman is under the protection of her husband. You want to question her? You'll need more than a poster from another territory." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Margaret could see Stone calculating, trying to decide if pushing this was worth the risk. Cole was a respected man in town, a veteran, a property owner. Stone was an outsider, a sheriff from Denver with no jurisdiction here. Finally, Stone picked up the poster. "I'll be keeping an eye on you, Mrs. Brennan, if that's who you really are. And if it turns out you're lying, well, that's obstruction of justice. That's a crime I can arrest you for." He tipped his hat. "Good day to you both." After he left, Margaret realized she was shaking. Cole sat back down, his expression grim. "How much time do we have?" he asked. "I don't know," Margaret whispered. "Days maybe. A week if we're lucky. Stone will wire Victor. Victor will send men. Real men, not just a corrupt sheriff." Cole was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood and held out his hand. "Come on, we've got work to do." "What work?" "If they're coming," Cole said, "then we need to be ready. And that means you need to learn how to protect yourself." That night in the forge, with the doors locked and the windows covered, Cole taught Margaret how to hold a gun. It was a Colt revolver, heavy and cold in her hands. She'd never touched a weapon before. The weight of it terrified her. "It's just a tool," Cole said, "like a hammer or a pen. In the right hands, it protects. In the wrong hands, it destroys. You need to decide which kind of hands you have." He stood behind her, guiding her arms, showing her how to aim, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. "I can't," Margaret whispered. "I can't shoot someone." "You can if it's them or you," Cole said quietly. "And it will be. When Victor's men come, they won't ask nicely. They won't give you a choice. You either fight or you die." Margaret closed her eyes. She thought about the 8 months in the asylum, the cold baths, the medications, the dark room, the way Dr. Webb had looked at her like she was a thing to be broken and reshaped. She thought about the families who'd lost everything because she'd been too afraid to fight back sooner. She opened her eyes and pulled the trigger. The gun kicked in her hands. The bullet hit the wooden target Cole had set up 6 inches off center. "Again," Cole said. She fired again, and again, and again. By the time the box of bullets was empty, her hands were steady and 3 of her shots had hit dead center. Cole reloaded the gun and handed it back to her. "Keep it," he said. "From now on, you don't go anywhere without it. And if anyone tries to take you, you shoot first and ask questions never. Understood?" Margaret took the gun. It felt different now. Not quite so foreign, still terrifying, but in a way that made her feel less helpless. "Understood," she said. And as she stood there in the forge holding a weapon for the first time in her life, Margaret Chen realized something fundamental had changed. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was preparing to fight. And when Victor's men came, and they would come, she would be ready. The sun rose over Medicine Bow like a promise. Cold, clear, unforgiving. Margaret stood at the window of the small room Cole had cleared for her above the forge, watching the town wake up. Smoke rose from chimneys. Horses stamped in their corrals. Men walked toward the general store, their breath fogging in the morning air. 3 weeks had passed since Sheriff Stone had shown her the wanted poster. 3 weeks of waiting for Victor's men to come. 3 weeks of learning to live in a place where half the town looked at her like she was a curiosity, and the other half looked at her like she was a threat. But they hadn't come. Not yet. Margaret had spent those weeks working. Cole had been right about one thing. Work kept the fear at bay. Work gave her hands something to do besides shake. Work made her feel like she was building something instead of just running from something. She'd reorganized Cole's entire business. Every contract, every transaction, every debt owed and owing was now recorded in a new ledger she'd purchased from the general store. She'd collected $220 from customers who'd conveniently forgotten they owed money to the blacksmith. She'd gone to the bank with Cole and watched Mr. Patterson's face turn purple as he'd been forced to refund the $110 in overcharged interest, $330. In 3 weeks, she'd put more money in Cole's hands than he'd seen in 6 months, the town had noticed. "That Chinese woman of yours is sharp as a tack," Tom Bradley, one of the local ranchers, had said just yesterday. He'd come to pick up a set of horseshoes and ended up staying for an hour while Margaret explained how he was being cheated by the feed supplier in Cheyenne. "Sharper than most men I know, if I'm being honest." It was a compliment and an insult wrapped together. Margaret had learned to accept both with the same neutral expression, but the town's opinion of her didn't matter as much as what she'd discovered 2 days ago. She'd been going through Cole's old correspondence, organizing the papers by date and subject when she'd found it. A letter from the Medicine Bow Bank to Cole Brennan, dated 6 months prior. A reminder that his loan contained a clause requiring him to maintain a minimum balance of $100 in his savings account or face immediate foreclosure. Cole didn't have a savings account. He'd never opened one. Margaret had read the clause 3 times, then pulled out the original loan contract. The clause wasn't there. Someone had added it after the fact, forged into the bank's records, but not present in Cole's copy of the agreement. It was the same trick Victor had used. The same type of fraud. Different scale, different players, but the same fundamental crime. And if the bank was doing it to Cole, they were doing it to others. She'd spent the last 2 days quietly visiting other businesses in Medicine Bow. The general store, the saloon, the livery. She'd asked careful questions, looked at contracts, compared what people remembered signing versus what the bank's records showed. By yesterday evening, she'd confirmed it. 7 businesses in Medicine Bow were being systematically defrauded by Patterson's bank. Small amounts, usually. A clause here, a fee there. Nothing big enough to make people suspicious. But over time, it added up to thousands of dollars. Enough to ruin families. Enough to force people to sell their property. And who bought that property? The bank. At prices well below market value. It was a land grab. Smaller than Victor's railroad scheme, but no less criminal. Margaret had told Cole last night. They'd sat in the forge after dark, the only light coming from the banked coals, and she'd laid out everything she'd found. Cole had listened in silence. When she finished, he'd stood and walked to the window, staring out at the dark street. "If you're right," he'd said finally, "Patterson isn't just a banker, he's a thief. And if we accuse him without proof solid enough to hang him, he'll bury us." "I know," Margaret had said. "That's why we need more than just contracts. We need the bank's internal ledgers, the ones that show what they actually recorded versus what they told people they recorded. Those ledgers are in Patterson's safe, inside the bank, which is locked every night." Margaret had met his eyes. "Then we need to get inside the bank." Now standing at the window in the pale morning light, Margaret watched as a rider came down the main street. He was moving fast, his horse lathered with sweat. He pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, dismounted, and went inside. 5 minutes later, Sheriff Stone emerged. He looked up and down the street, then walked directly toward the forge. Margaret's hand went to the pocket of her dress, where the Colt revolver rested heavy and cold. Stone knocked on the door. Margaret didn't move. Downstairs, she heard Cole answer. "Morning, Sheriff. What can I do for you?" "Need to talk to your wife, Brennan. Official business." "She's my wife." "You can talk to me." There was a pause. Margaret moved closer to the top of the stairs, listening. "There's been a development," Stone said. His voice was careful, controlled. "Got word from Denver. Seems there's a federal marshal coming through Medicine Bow in 3 days. Name's Harrison. He's investigating claims of fraud in the territorial bank system." Margaret's heart jumped. A federal marshal. Someone who might not be bought. Someone who might actually listen. "What's that got to do with my wife?" Cole asked. "Marshal Harrison specifically requested to speak with anyone who has knowledge of banking irregularities. Word is he's looking into Central Pacific Railroad's land acquisitions. Seems someone's been making noise about forged contracts." The silence that followed was heavy as iron. "I'll mention it to my wife," Cole said finally, "but I don't see what railroad business has to do with us. We're blacksmiths, not bankers." "Of course," Stone said. "Just thought you should know. Marshall will be here Friday, staying at Ida's boarding house. If your wife wants to talk to him, that's where he'll be." After Stone left, Margaret came downstairs. Cole was standing in the middle of the forge, his expression unreadable. "It's a trap," Margaret said. "It has to be. Victor wouldn't send a real federal marshal. He'd send someone pretending to be one." "Maybe," Cole said. "Or maybe it's real. Maybe someone in Denver actually cares about what's happening out here." "You don't believe that?" Cole looked at her. "What I believe doesn't matter. What matters is what we do. If this marshal is real, he could be the break we need. If he's fake, we need to know that too." He walked to his workbench and pulled out a hammer. "I know someone who can help us figure out which it is, but you're not going to like it." "Who?" "Running Deer. He's a tracker. Works sometimes for the Army, sometimes for the territorial government. If anyone can find out whether Marshal Harrison is legitimate, it's him." Margaret had met Running Deer once briefly. He was Shoshone, about Cole's age, with eyes that seemed to see everything and a way of moving that made no sound. He'd come to the forge a week ago to get a rifle barrel repaired, had nodded at Margaret and left without speaking more than 10 words. "You trust him?" Margaret asked. "With my life," Cole said simply. "He saved it once. I saved his twice. That's the kind of bond that doesn't break." He set down the hammer. "I'll ride out to his camp this afternoon. Ask him to make some inquiries. Meanwhile, you keep working on the bank ledgers problem. If this marshal is real, we're going to need evidence. Not just about Victor, but about Patterson, too." Margaret nodded. Then, before she could stop herself, she asked, "Why are you doing this? Helping me, I mean. You could have turned me over to Stone that first day, collected the $600, paid off your loan." Cole was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was soft. 3 years ago, my wife, Anna, was pregnant. We were happy. Stupid happy, the kind that makes you think nothing bad can ever happen. Then one day she went into labor. It was early, too early. The midwife came, did what she could, but it wasn't enough. Anna bled for 6 hours. She died holding my hand. The baby died an hour later. He looked at Margaret, and she saw the old pain in his eyes, still raw, still bleeding in its own way. "I couldn't save her," Cole continued. "Couldn't do a damn thing but watch her die. And I swore that day that if I ever had the chance to help someone who needed it, I wouldn't hesitate. I wouldn't calculate the cost. I'd just do it." He picked up the hammer again. "You needed help, so I helped. Simple as that." Margaret felt something tighten in her throat. "I'm sorry about Anna." "So am I," Cole said. "Every day. But being sorry doesn't bring her back. Working does. Living does. Helping people does." He met her eyes. "You've helped me too, Margaret, more than you know. This forge was dying before you got here. Now it's actually making money. I can sleep at night knowing the bank isn't going to take it from me." He paused. "So maybe we're even. Or maybe we're just two people trying to survive in a world that's harder than it should be. Either way, I'm glad you got off that coach." Margaret couldn't speak. She just nodded. Cole turned back to his work. Get your coat, we're going into town. Ida's been asking to see you, and you need to start building relationships with the women. If this marshal is real and things go sideways, we'll need allies. The men in this town might not trust you yet, but the women will if Ida vouches for you. Ida Henderson's boarding house smelled like bread and coffee and the kind of cleanliness that came from decades of hard work. The front room was warm heated by a massive cast-iron stove that Ida tended like a garden. 4 women sat around a large table sewing. They all looked up when Margaret entered. "Ladies," Ida said, "this is Mary Brennan, Cole's wife. She's going to join us for the afternoon, if that's all right." The women exchanged glances. Margaret recognized one of them, Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife. She was in her 40s, thin, with tired eyes and hands that never stopped moving. "Of course," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "Please sit." Margaret sat. Ida handed her a basket of fabric scraps and a needle. "We're making quilts for the church auction. Can you sew?" "Not well," Margaret admitted. "Then you'll learn," Ida said firmly. "Everyone starts somewhere." For the next hour, Margaret sat with the women and learned how to make neat, even stitches. Her fingers were clumsy at first, used to holding pens, not needles, but she persisted, and slowly the stitches became more regular. The women talked as they worked, gossip mostly. Who was courting whom, whose crops had failed, whose husband drank too much. It was the kind of conversation Margaret had never been part of before. Intimate, domestic, the private language of women who'd learned to build lives in hard places. Then Mrs. Patterson spoke. "I need to ask you something," she said, looking at Margaret. "Is it true you found an error in the bank's records with Cole's loan?" The room went quiet. Every woman stopped sewing. Margaret chose her words carefully. "I found a discrepancy between the contract Cole signed and what the bank was charging him." "Yes." "My husband says you accused him of fraud. I accused him of making a mistake," Margaret said. "There's a difference." Mrs. Patterson's fingers fumbled with the key slightly. "Did you find mistakes in anyone else's accounts?" Margaret met her eyes. She saw something there, fear, and a desperate kind of hope. "I've looked at several accounts," Margaret said carefully. "I found irregularities in most of them." "Including mine." Mrs. Patterson's voice was barely a whisper. Margaret hesitated. This was dangerous territory. Accusing a man's wife of being a victim of his crimes was delicate business, but Mrs. Patterson's eyes were pleading. "Yes," Margaret said softly, "including yours." Mrs. Patterson's face crumpled. She pressed her hands to her mouth, her whole body shaking. The other women immediately moved to comfort her, but she waved them away. "I knew it," she whispered. "I knew something was wrong. We've been married 22 years. I've kept the household accounts the entire time. And for the last 5 years, the numbers haven't made sense. We should have more money. We should be comfortable. But every month there's less. Every month we're closer to losing everything." She looked at Margaret. "My husband tells me I'm foolish with money, that I don't understand banking. But I'm not foolish. I know how to count." "You're not foolish," Margaret said firmly, "and you're not wrong. The numbers don't make sense because they've been changed. Your husband has been stealing from his own customers, including you." The room erupted. 3 of the 4 women started talking at once. Questions, denials, demands for proof. Only Ida remained silent, watching Margaret with sharp, calculating eyes. Finally, Ida raised her hand. The room quieted. "Let's say you're right," Ida said to Margaret. "Let's say Patterson is a thief. What are you going to do about it?" "I'm going to prove it," Margaret said. "And then I'm going to make sure he faces justice for it." "How?" Margaret took a breath. This was the moment. She could keep her secrets, play it safe, avoid making waves. Or she could trust these women the way Cole had trusted her. She chose trust. "There's a federal marshal coming to Medicine Bow in 3 days," Margaret said. "If he's legitimate, I'm going to give him evidence of banking fraud. Not just Patterson's crimes, but bigger ones. Crimes that involve railroad companies and judges and land theft on a massive scale." She looked at Mrs. Patterson. "Your husband is small compared to the men I'm really after, but he's part of the same system. And that system needs to be broken." Mrs. Patterson wiped her eyes. "If you expose him, I'll lose everything. The house, my standing in the community, possibly my marriage." "Yes," Margaret said honestly. You will. I'm sorry for that, but if I don't expose him, how many more families will he ruin?" The older woman was silent for a long moment. Then she straightened her shoulders. "I have a key," she said quietly, "to the bank. My husband keeps one at home in case of emergencies. I can get it." Margaret's heart jumped. "You'd help me." "He's my husband," Mrs. Patterson said, "but he's also a thief. And I've watched good people in this town suffer because of his greed." Her voice was steady now, certain. "If you can stop him, if you can make sure he faces consequences, then yes, I'll help you." Ida leaned back in her chair. "Well then, looks like we're robbing a bank." "We're not robbing anything," Margaret corrected. "We're gathering evidence. In the middle of the night, by breaking into a locked building, while the owner sleeps." Ida's eyes glinted with something that might have been amusement. "Call it what you want, girl. I call it the most excitement this town's had in a decade." That night, Margaret lay in her small room and stared at the ceiling. Below, she could hear Cole moving around the forge, the familiar sounds of metal on metal, work that never stopped even in the dark. She thought about Mrs. Patterson's face, the way her hands had trembled when she'd offered to betray her husband, the way she'd sat up straighter after making the decision as if a weight had been lifted. Margaret understood that feeling, the relief that came from choosing action over acceptance, from deciding that some things were worth fighting for even if the fight destroyed you. She thought about the 8 pages hidden in her bag, the evidence that had cost so much already: Jonathan Whitmore's life, Marshall Davis's life, 8 months of her own life locked in a place designed to break minds. And she thought about what would happen if this Marshall Harrison was real, if she could actually get the evidence in front of someone who had the power to act on it. Victor would come for her, that was certain. Men like Victor didn't forgive. They didn't forget. They eliminated threats. But maybe, just maybe, if she moved fast enough, gathered enough evidence, involved enough people, she could make it too expensive for Victor to silence her, make the truth too loud to suppress. It was a gamble, the kind that could get everyone she cared about killed. But what was the alternative? Run again, keep running until Victor's reach caught up with her, live the rest of her life as Mary Sullivan, always looking over her shoulder, always waiting for the knock on the door that meant it was over. No. Margaret had spent 8 months as a prisoner. She was done running, done hiding. If Victor wanted to find her, let him come. She'd be ready. A knock on her door made her sit up. "Yes?" "It's me," Cole said from the other side. "Can I come in?" "Yes." Cole entered, carrying a lantern. In the flickering light, his face looked older, worn, but determined. "Running Deer just got back," he said. "Rode hard from Cheyenne." He checked with the Territorial Marshal's office. "Harrison is real. He's a federal marshal appointed directly by the Attorney General in Washington. He's been investigating railroad fraud for 6 months." Margaret felt her breath catch. So it's not a trap. Doesn't seem to be. Running Deer talked to 3 different people who confirmed it. Harrison's reputation is solid, honest, incorruptible, they say, though that's a word people throw around too easily. Cole sat down on the edge of her bed, the lantern casting shadows on the wall. "But here's the thing. Harrison's not coming here by accident. Someone told him to come to Medicine Bow. Someone pointed him in this direction, who Running Deer couldn't find out. But whoever it was knew about the banking fraud here and knew about the railroad schemes. That's not common knowledge. That's inside information." Margaret's mind raced. Victor has enemies, other businessmen he's crossed, politicians he's refused to bribe. It could be any of them. Or it could be a trap inside a trap, Cole said. Harrison could be real, but the person who sent him could be working for Victor. Lead you out into the open, make you reveal what you know, then eliminate you before Harrison can act on it. It was possible, more than possible. It was exactly the kind of chess move Victor would make. "So what do we do?" Margaret asked. Cole was quiet for a moment. "We prepare for both possibilities. If Harrison is clean, we give him everything. The bank fraud, the railroad schemes, all of it. We bury Victor and Patterson both. But if he's compromised, if he makes one wrong move or asks one wrong question, we disappear. I've got horses ready. Supplies packed. Running Deer knows routes through the mountains that no one else can follow." He looked at her. "But that's only if you want to fight. You could still run right now, tonight. I'd help you, give you money, a good horse, a map to somewhere safe." "There is nowhere safe," Margaret said. "Not from men like Victor. He has reach across 6 territories, money in a dozen states. I run now, I'll spend the rest of my life running." She met Cole's eyes. "I'm tired of running. I want to stand and fight, even if it kills you." "Especially if it kills me," Margaret said, "because at least I'll die on my feet instead of on my knees." Cole studied her face in the lamplight. Then he nodded slowly. "All right, then. We fight." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Margaret, when this is over, however it ends, I want you to know something. These past few weeks working with you, talking with you, teaching you to shoot and watching you teach me about numbers. It's been good. Better than good." He cleared his throat. "Anna was my wife. I loved her. Still do in the way you love someone who's gone. But you're different. You're here. And somewhere along the way this stopped being just a business arrangement for me." Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "Cole? I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I know what you've been through. I know you can't give me what I might want. I just needed you to know, in case things go wrong, in case I don't get another chance to say it." He left before she could respond, closing the door softly behind him. Margaret sat in the darkness, her hands shaking. Not from fear this time, from something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. 2 days later, Margaret stood in the alley behind the bank at 2 in the morning, holding a key in one hand and a lantern in the other. Cole stood beside her. Mrs. Patterson stood behind them, wrapped in a dark cloak, her face pale but resolute. "Last chance to back out," Cole whispered. "No backing out," Margaret said. She inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. They slipped inside. The bank was dark, silent, smelling of ink and paper and old wood. Margaret had memorized the layout during her visits with Cole. Patterson's office was in the back, behind the main counter. The safe was there. They moved through the darkness, the lantern's light casting wild shadows on the walls. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like thunder. Every breath seemed too loud. Patterson's office was locked. Mrs. Patterson produced another key, her hands shaking as she tried to insert it into the lock. "Let me," Cole said gently. He took the key and unlocked the door with steady hands. Inside the safe sat against the far wall. It was a massive thing, iron and steel with a combination lock that looked impenetrable. "I don't know the combination," Mrs. Patterson whispered. "He never told me." Margaret knelt in front of the safe, studying it. She'd learned about safes from Mr. Whitmore. The lawyer had kept one in his office, and he'd shown her how it worked, how the tumblers aligned, how the mechanism clicked into place. She pressed her ear against the cool metal and began to turn the dial, slowly, carefully. Listening, click. First number. She turned the dial the other way. Click. Second number. Cole and Mrs. Patterson watched in silence, barely breathing. Click. Third number. Margaret grabbed the handle and pulled. The safe door swung open. Inside were ledgers, stacks of them, and a metal box filled with papers. Margaret pulled out the ledgers, opening them one by one, scanning the entries by lantern light. There. The discrepancies were all recorded here, the forged clauses, the inflated interest rates, the manufactured fees. Every crime Patterson had committed was written in his own hand. She pulled out the metal box. Inside were contracts, deeds to properties, and letters from someone in Denver instructing Patterson on which families to target, which lands to acquire. The letters were signed with a single initial, A. Margaret's blood ran cold. She knew that initial. Victor's middle name was Aldrich, but his first name was Vincent Aldrich. V.A. This wasn't just local corruption. This was Victor's work. He had his hand in Medicine Bow, just like he had his hand everywhere else. Patterson wasn't an independent thief. He was part of Victor's network, which meant Victor already knew where she was. "We need to go," Margaret said urgently. "Now." "What's wrong?" Cole asked. "This isn't Patterson's operation. It's Victor's. He's been using Patterson to acquire land here, which means he knows I'm here. He's probably known for weeks." The sound of footsteps outside froze them all. Cole moved to the window and looked out. His face went pale. "There are men outside. 6 of them. Armed." Margaret's mind raced. They were trapped. The back door led to an alley with only one exit. The front door led to the main street where the armed men were gathering. "The roof," Mrs. Patterson whispered. "There's a hatch in the ceiling of the back room. It leads to the roof. From there you can jump to the livery next door." "What about you?" Margaret asked. "I live here. I have an excuse to be in my husband's bank. You don't." Mrs. Patterson gripped Margaret's hand. "Take the ledgers. Take everything. Make sure he pays for what he's done." Cole was already moving, gathering the ledgers, stuffing them into a canvas bag he'd brought. Margaret took the metal box. They ran to the back room. The hatch was there, barely visible in the ceiling. Cole climbed on a desk, pushed it open, then pulled himself through. He reached down for Margaret. She grabbed his hand and he hauled her up. The roof was slanted, slippery with frost. The livery was 8 feet away, across a gap that looked like a canyon in the dark. Below they heard men breaking down the bank's front door. "Jump," Cole said. "I can't." "You can. I'll go first. You follow. Don't think. Just jump." Cole backed up 3 steps, then ran and leaped across the gap. He hit the livery roof hard, rolled, came up on his feet. "Now you," he called. Margaret looked down. The alley was 15 feet below. If she fell, she'd break bones. If she stayed, Victor's men would kill her. She backed up, ran, jumped. For one terrible moment she was flying, suspended in the cold night air, the bag of ledgers clutched to her chest. Then Cole's hands were grabbing her coat, pulling her forward, and she crashed onto the livery roof beside him. They scrambled across the roof, dropped into the livery, through a hayloft, and ran. Behind them they heard shouting, gunshots. Cole's horses were waiting behind the forge, just as he'd said. 2 of them already saddled, loaded with supplies. They mounted and rode. East, away from town, into the darkness of the Wyoming plains. Behind them, Medicine Bow erupted in chaos. Lanterns lit, men shouting, more gunshots. But Margaret and Cole were already gone, swallowed by the night, riding hard toward whatever came next. As the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of red and gold, they stopped to rest the horses. Margaret was shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. Cole handed her a canteen. She drank the water, cold and perfect. "We did it," she said. "We got the evidence." "We got some of it," Cole corrected. "But we lost the town. Patterson will claim we robbed him. Stone will put out warrants. And Victor now knows for certain that you're alive and that you have enough evidence to hurt him." He looked at her, his expression grave. "This is war now, Margaret. Real war. No more hiding. No more pretending. Are you ready for that?" Margaret thought about Mrs. Patterson standing in the bank, ready to face her husband's wrath to do the right thing. She thought about Ida and the women who'd welcomed her. She thought about the families whose lands had been stolen, whose lives had been destroyed. She thought about who she'd been 3 weeks ago, a prisoner, a victim, someone who survived by staying small and quiet and invisible. She wasn't that person anymore. "I'm ready," she said. Cole nodded. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He handed it to her. Margaret unwrapped it. Inside was a rose, but not a real rose. This one was made of iron, forged from black metal, every petal hammered into delicate curves that caught the morning light. "I made it," Cole said quietly. "Spent 3 nights working on it after you went to sleep. Each petal took an hour. I wanted to make something that would last, something that wouldn't wilt or die or fade." He met her eyes. "Like us, like what we're building. It's not perfect. It's got rough edges, but it's strong, and it'll outlast anything that tries to destroy it." Margaret held the iron rose, feeling the weight of it, the care that had gone into every curve and edge. Her throat was tight. "Cole, I don't know what to say." "Say you'll marry me," Cole said. "For real this time. Not a business arrangement, not a legal protection. A real marriage, partners in everything, fighting together, building together. Whatever comes, we face it together." Margaret looked at him. This man who'd found her freezing in a blizzard and given her shelter. Who'd believed her when she'd told him the truth. Who'd taught her to shoot and trusted her with his business and stood beside her when she'd decided to fight instead of run. This man who'd forged her a rose out of iron because he wanted to give her something that would last. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Cole smiled. It was the first real smile she'd seen from him, lighting up his whole face, making him look younger, happier. He leaned forward and kissed her. It was gentle, careful, asking permission with every second. Margaret kissed him back, tasting salt and dust and coffee and something that felt like home. When they pulled apart, the sun was fully risen, burning away the last of the night's shadows. "So what now?" Margaret asked. "Now we ride to Cheyenne," Cole said. "We find Marshal Harrison. We give him everything. The bank ledgers, your railroad evidence, all of it. And then we let the law do what it's supposed to do." "And if the law fails?" Cole's expression hardened. "Then we do what people have always done when the law fails. We make our own justice." They mounted up and rode toward Cheyenne, toward the federal marshal who might save them or damn them, toward a future that was uncertain and dangerous and completely their own. Behind them, Medicine Bow grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. But ahead, the mountains rose like promises, and somewhere beyond them was the chance to stop running and start living. Margaret touched the iron rose in her pocket. She thought about how something could be forged in fire and come out stronger. She thought about how she'd been broken and was being rebuilt. And she thought about the man riding beside her who'd looked at her and seen not a victim, not a fugitive, not a half-breed or a Chinese woman or any of the labels people tried to pin on her. He'd seen Margaret, just Margaret. And that was enough. They rode into the rising sun, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Margaret Chen wasn't afraid. She was ready. The federal courthouse in Cheyenne was built of stone and arrogance. It loomed over the street like a monument to the law's indifference, its windows reflecting the pale winter sky in blank, unseeing squares. Margaret stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, clutching the canvas bag of ledgers against her chest. Her other hand rested in her coat pocket, fingers wrapped around the Colt revolver Cole had given her. The iron rose he'd forged sat in her other pocket, a reminder of why she was here. "You don't have to do this," Cole said quietly beside her. "We could still ride. Head to California, Montana. Somewhere Victor's reach doesn't extend." Margaret looked at him. In the month since they'd fled Medicine Bow, Cole had become her anchor. They'd traveled slowly, carefully, avoiding main roads and staying in towns where no one asked questions. They'd been married by a circuit preacher in a settlement so small it didn't have a name, just a church and 6 houses. The ceremony had lasted 10 minutes. The kiss afterward had lasted longer. "There is nowhere his reach doesn't extend," Margaret said. "And I'm tired of measuring my life by how far I can run." She started up the steps. Cole followed. Marshal Harrison's office was on the 3rd floor at the end of a hallway that smelled like old paper and newer tobacco. The door was open. Inside, a man sat behind a desk covered in documents. He was younger than Margaret had expected, maybe 40, with sandy hair going gray at the temples and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much too soon. He looked up when they entered. "You must be the Brennans. I've been expecting you." Margaret's hand tightened on the revolver. "How did you know we'd come?" "Because 3 weeks ago, the bank in Medicine Bow was robbed. 2 days later, Sheriff Blake Stone wired every law office from here to Denver, claiming the thieves were a blacksmith and his Chinese wife. And yesterday, a very nervous woman named Mrs. Patterson sent me a telegram saying I should listen to whatever you had to say." Harrison gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. "Sit, please." They sat. Margaret kept the bag on her lap. Harrison leaned back in his chair. "I've been investigating railroad fraud for 8 months. Started in Kansas, followed the trail through Colorado, and now I'm here. Every lead I chase ends in a dead body or a dead end. Witnesses disappear. Documents burn. Evidence vanishes." He looked directly at Margaret. "You're either the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish, coming here with evidence against Victor Aldrich. Do you have any idea how many people that man has killed to protect his empire?" 17, Margaret said. "At minimum, probably more." Harrison's eyebrows rose. "You've counted." "I've done more than count. I've documented. Names, dates, methods. I have photographs of forged contracts, payment records to judges, letters detailing the entire scheme." She set the canvas bag on his desk. "And I have the bank ledgers from Medicine Bow showing how the fraud extends down to the territorial level." Harrison opened the bag slowly, as if it might contain a snake. He pulled out the first ledger, scanned a page, then another. His face went very still. "This is Patterson's handwriting. Yes. And these entries show systematic fraud against 7 businesses in Medicine Bow. Correct. Harrison set down the ledger and pulled out the metal box. He opened it, read the first letter, then the second. When he looked up, his expression was grim. Miss Chen, do you understand what you've brought me? Evidence of a criminal conspiracy involving a major railroad corporation, territorial judges, local law enforcement, and banking institutions across 3 territories. No, Harrison said quietly. You've brought me a war, the kind that gets federal marshals killed, the kind that makes careers disappear and witnesses die in convenient accidents. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the street below. I've been trying to build a case against Aldrich for months. Every time I get close, something happens. My last witness was found hanging in his cell. Suicide, the report said, except the man was 6'4" and the rope was tied to a beam he couldn't have reached without a ladder. Harrison turned back to them. If I take this evidence, if I move forward with prosecution, you become targets, both of you. Aldrich will throw everything he has at silencing you before this goes to trial. He's already throwing everything at us, Cole said. We're targets whether you take the evidence or not. At least this way, his crimes might actually see daylight. Harrison studied Cole for a long moment. You're a veteran. Cavalry, if I'm reading the scars right. 4th Cavalry, served 6 years on the frontier. Then you know what it's like when the enemy has superior numbers and better position. You know how those fights usually end. Usually, Cole agreed, but not always. Harrison returned to his desk. He pulled out a document and began to write. I'm going to issue a federal warrant for Victor Aldrich's arrest. Conspiracy to defraud, forgery, bribery of public officials, and accessory to murder. I'm also issuing warrants for 12 judges and 6 local sheriffs, including Blake Stone. He looked up. This will take approximately 3 days to process through the federal system. During those 3 days, you 2 will be in protective custody. I have a safe house outside of town. It's not comfortable, but it's secure. We can take care of ourselves, Margaret said. I'm sure you can, but humor me. I've lost too many witnesses already. I'm not losing you. The safe house was a cabin 20 miles north of Cheyenne, nestled in a canyon where the wind never stopped blowing, and the only visitors were eagles. A deputy marshal named Carson stayed with them, a quiet man in his 50s who spent most of his time reading and cleaning his rifle. Margaret spent those 3 days organizing the evidence into a presentation that would be impossible to ignore. She created timelines, cross-referenced documents, built a narrative that connected every piece of the puzzle. Cole helped his practical mind finding gaps in her logic, asking questions that made her argument stronger. On the 3rd night, as they sat by the fire reviewing the materials one last time, Cole set down the papers he'd been reading. Win or lose, he said, I want you to know something. These past 2 months with you have been the best months I've had in 3 years. Maybe longer. Margaret looked at him across the firelight. Even though we've been running for our lives, especially because of that, running with you is better than standing still alone. He paused. Anna was my wife, and I loved her, but we were young when we married. We didn't really know each other. We were building a life together, but we hadn't built a partnership. He met Margaret's eyes. You and me, we started as partners. The love came after, and somehow that makes it stronger. Like your iron rose, forged in fire instead of grown in a garden. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She'd cried more in the past 2 months than in the previous 2 years, but these were different tears, not grief or fear, something else, something that felt like the opposite of breaking. I love you, she said. The words felt strange in her mouth, foreign, but true. I didn't think I could love anyone after what Victor did to me. Didn't think I had any trust left to give. But you make me want to try. Cole crossed the small space between them and took her hands. His palms were rough with calluses, warm and solid and real. Then try, he said. We'll both try, and maybe we'll fail sometimes. Maybe we'll hurt each other without meaning to, but at least we'll be failing and hurting together. He kissed her, and this time there was no hesitation, no careful asking of permission. This time it was a claim and a promise and a surrender all at once. Carson coughed loudly from his chair by the door, making a show of being very interested in his rifle. Cole and Margaret broke apart, both of them flushing like teenagers. "Sorry to interrupt," Carson said, not sounding sorry at all, "but you two might want to save the romance for after the trial. Marshal Harrison just sent word. The warrants have been issued. Tomorrow morning, federal agents will arrest Victor Aldrich in Denver." Margaret's heart jumped. "They found him. He's staying at the Brown Palace Hotel. Has been for the past week. Apparently he's not worried about being caught." Carson's expression was grim. Or he's setting a trap. The next morning, they rode back to Cheyenne under armed escort. 6 deputy marshals, all heavily armed, surrounded their wagon like a military convoy. The streets of Cheyenne were busier than Margaret remembered, crowded with people going about their ordinary lives, unaware that the next few hours might reshape the entire territory. The courthouse was different today. Armed guards stood at every entrance. Spectators packed the gallery, craning their necks to see the proceedings. Journalists filled an entire row, their pencils poised over notebooks. Marshal Harrison met them at the courthouse steps. His face was drawn, exhausted. "Aldrich is here," he said without preamble. "They brought him in this morning." He came quietly. Too quietly. "What do you mean?" Cole asked. "I mean he's acting like a man who knows something we don't. He's got 3 lawyers, expensive ones from San Francisco, and he's smiling." Margaret's stomach tightened. What could he know? That's what worries me. The preliminary hearing began at 10 o'clock. Margaret sat in the witness gallery with Cole beside her, watching as Victor Aldrich was led into the courtroom. He looked exactly as she remembered. Silver hair perfectly combed, expensive suit without a wrinkle, and those eyes cold and calculating, scanning the room like a predator assessing prey. His gaze found her. For one long moment, they stared at each other across the crowded courtroom. Victor smiled. Not a friendly smile, a knife smile, sharp and promising pain. Then he turned away as if she were nothing, as if she'd already been dismissed, handled, forgotten. The judge, a severe woman named Blackwood, called the court to order. Harrison stood and began to present the evidence. He was methodical, thorough, building the case piece by piece, the forged contracts, the bribed judges, the payment records. Victor's lawyers objected at every turn, but Judge Blackwood overruled them again and again. As the evidence mounted, the spectators began to murmur. This wasn't just fraud. This was a conspiracy that touched every level of territorial government. Then it was Margaret's turn to testify. She walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like water. The bailiff swore her in. She placed her hand on the Bible and promised to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Judge Blackwood looked at her with sharp, assessing eyes. "Please state your name for the record." Margaret Chen Brennan, one of Victor's lawyers, stood. He was young, handsome, with the kind of confidence that came from never having lost. "Your Honor, we object to this witness. She's testified under an assumed name in the past. Her credibility is questionable." "Overruled," Judge Blackwood said. "The witness may proceed." Harrison walked her through her testimony. Her work for Jonathan Whitmore, the night she'd witnessed Victor kill the lawyer, her 8 months in the asylum, her escape, her discovery of the banking fraud in Medicine Bow. She spoke clearly, calmly, reciting facts as if they were columns in a ledger, numbers and dates and names. No emotion, just evidence. When Harrison finished, Victor's lead lawyer stood for cross-examination. His name was Thornton, and he moved like a shark circling wounded prey. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, making her name sound like an accusation, "you claim to have witnessed a murder, yet you never reported this to the authorities at the time. Why not? Because the authorities were bought by the man who committed the murder." "That's a serious allegation. Do you have proof?" "Marshal Davis, the federal officer I reported the crime to, died 3 days later. Heart attack, according to the official report. He was 35 years old with no history of heart problems." Thornton smiled. "People die, Mrs. Brennan, young and old alike. That doesn't make every death a conspiracy." "No? But when everyone who stands in Victor Aldrich's way happens to die conveniently, that stops being coincidence and starts being pattern." The gallery murmured. Judge Blackwood banged her gavel. Thornton changed tactics. "You've admitted to using a false identity. Mary Sullivan, you stole a dead woman's name." "I took the name of a woman who no longer needed it to escape a man who wanted me dead." "Yes." "So you're a liar, an identity thief." And you expect this court to believe your testimony against a respected businessman? Margaret felt the old fear rising, the instinct to make herself small, to apologize, to submit. But then she felt the weight of the iron rose in her pocket. She thought about Cole sitting in the gallery, trusting her to be strong. She thought about Mrs. Patterson, who'd risked everything to help her. She thought about the 17 families who'd lost everything because she hadn't been brave enough to fight sooner. She looked directly at Thornton. I'm a survivor. I did what I had to do to stay alive. And yes, I expect this court to believe me, because unlike your client, I have evidence. Documented, photographed, verified evidence. What does Mr. Aldrich have? Expensive lawyers and blood on his hands. The courtroom erupted. Thornton's face went red. Judge Blackwood's gavel cracked like thunder. That's enough, the judge said. Mr. Thornton, do you have further questions? No, Your Honor. Margaret returned to her seat. Her hands were still trembling, but her heart was steady. She'd done it. She'd looked Victor in the eye and refused to blink. The hearing continued for 3 more hours. More evidence, more testimony. By the end, even Victor's lawyers looked pale. Judge Blackwood reviewed her notes. The courtroom held its breath. Based on the evidence presented, she said, I find probable cause to bind over the defendant, Victor Aldrich, for trial on all charges. Bail is denied due to flight risk and the severity of the charges. The defendant will be remanded to federal custody pending trial. The gavel fell. The gallery exploded into noise. Journalists rushed for the doors. Victor stood slowly. He looked at Margaret one more time. And this time he wasn't smiling. This isn't over, he mouthed. Margaret lifted her chin. Yes, she mouthed back. It is. But she was wrong. That night, as Margaret and Cole ate dinner at a small hotel under the watchful eyes of 2 deputy marshals, a messenger arrived with a telegram. Harrison read it, his face going white. What is it? Margaret asked. Patterson is dead. Someone broke into the Medicine Bow jail last night and hanged him in his cell, made it look like suicide. Cole swore. They're cleaning up loose ends. It gets worse, Harrison said. 3 of the judges named in the warrants have fled. 2 were found dead this morning. And there's been a fire at the Territorial Records Office in Denver. Half the land deeds we needed for evidence are gone. Margaret felt cold spreading through her chest. Victor's still giving orders, even from jail. He's got people on the outside. Money buys loyalty, or at least obedience. Harrison folded the telegram. The trial is in 6 weeks. Between now and then, we need to keep you alive and gather enough additional evidence to replace what's been destroyed. How? Margaret asked. You're going to do what you do best. Follow the money, track the paper trail, build the case from the inside out. Harrison looked at both of them. But you can't do it from Cheyenne. Too visible. Too many of Aldrich's people watching. Then where? Cole asked. Harrison smiled grimly. You're going back to Medicine Bow. They returned to Medicine Bow on a cold morning in late February. The town looked different, smaller somehow, as if Margaret's brief time away had given her new perspective. Or maybe it was just that she'd changed. Ida Henderson was waiting on her boarding house porch when they rode up. She crossed her arms and fixed them both with a stern look. Heard you 2 robbed the bank and got Patterson killed. We exposed the bank, Margaret corrected, and Patterson got himself killed by working for a murderer. Semantics. But Ida's expression softened. Also heard you got Victor Aldrich arrested. That true? He's awaiting trial in Cheyenne. Federal charges. Ida nodded slowly. Good. About time someone stood up to that snake. She stepped off the porch. Town's been in chaos since you left. Stone disappeared the same night you did. New sheriff came in from Laramie. Name's Dawson. He's actually honest, far as I can tell. Might be the first honest lawman Medicine Bow's had in 10 years. She looked at Cole. Your forge is still standing. No one touched it. But there's been talk. Some folks think you're heroes. Some think you're troublemakers. You'll need to tread careful. We always do, Cole said. They moved back into the forge that same day. It felt strange, like returning to a life they'd left behind, except they were different people now. The married couple who'd fled in the night had been pretending. The married couple who returned was real. Margaret threw herself into the work. She spent 12 hours a day, tracking down evidence, traveling to neighboring towns, interviewing families who'd lost land to the railroad schemes. She documented everything, every signature, every sale, every suspicious death. Cole worked beside her, using his connections from his cavalry days to gather information from soldiers and scouts and traders who moved through the territory. Slowly, painstakingly, they rebuilt what had been destroyed in the Denver fire, and in the evenings when the work was done and the forge was banked for the night, they lived. Really lived. They cooked simple meals together, Margaret learning from Cole how to make edible food. They talked, sharing stories from their pasts, filling in the gaps that crisis and urgency had left empty. They made love carefully, tenderly, Margaret learning that touch could be gentle and that her body was her own, to give, not something to be taken. 1 month after their return, Margaret realized her monthly bleeding was late. Very late. She told Cole over breakfast. He set down his coffee cup and stared at her. "You're sure? I'm never late. Not in 10 years. How do you feel?" Margaret took inventory. Tired, queasy in the mornings, her breasts tender. "Like I might be pregnant." Cole stood, walked around the table, and pulled her into his arms. He didn't say anything, just held her, while his whole body shook with something that might have been fear or joy or both. "Anna died in childbirth," he finally whispered into her hair. "The baby, too. I can't lose you like that. I can't." Margaret held him tighter. "You won't. I'm not Anna. And this isn't then." But fear had entered their small, careful happiness, and it didn't leave. Dr. Yates, the new physician who'd come to Medicine Bow to replace the disgraced Dr. Frost, confirmed the pregnancy 3 weeks later. Margaret was 2 months along, healthy, strong. But every examination, every checkup, Cole's anxiety grew. "Women die in childbirth all the time," he said one night, "especially frontier women, especially without proper hospitals." "Then we'll go to Denver when the time comes," Margaret said, "or Cheyenne, somewhere with a real hospital." "And if the baby comes early, if something goes wrong?" Margaret took his face in her hands. "Then we deal with it, together, like everything else." But privately, she was afraid too. She'd survived Victor, survived running, survived testifying. But childbirth was different. Childbirth didn't care how brave you were. The trial began on the first Monday in April. The courthouse in Cheyenne was packed beyond capacity. Every newspaper in the territory had sent reporters. Several from as far as San Francisco and Chicago had made the journey. Margaret testified for 3 days. She walked the jury through every piece of evidence, every forged signature, every bribed official, every family destroyed. Cole testified about the banking fraud in Medicine Bow, bringing ledgers and documents that corroborated Margaret's claims. 23 other witnesses testified. Farmers who'd lost their land, widows whose husbands had died fighting the railroad takeovers, former employees of Central Pacific who'd been ordered to forge documents and had refused. Victor's defense was simple. He denied everything. His lawyers claimed the signatures were genuine, the land sales legitimate, the accusations nothing but lies from disgruntled former business partners. But the evidence was overwhelming. Photographs didn't lie. Ledgers didn't fabricate themselves. 40 witnesses couldn't all be mistaken. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and read the verdict. "We find the defendant, Victor Vincent Aldrich, guilty on all counts." The courtroom exploded. Journalists ran for the telegraph offices. Spectators cheered or cursed depending on which side they'd taken. Judge Blackwood's gavel couldn't restore order for 5 full minutes. When silence finally fell, the judge looked at Victor. He stood straight, his face expressionless, but his hands cuffed at his wrists were trembling. "Victor Aldrich," Judge Blackwood said, "you have been found guilty of conspiracy to defraud, forgery, bribery of public officials, and accessory to murder. I hereby sentence you to 30 years in the federal penitentiary with no possibility of parole." 30 years. Victor would be 80 years old when he was released, if he lived that long. As the marshals led him away, Victor's eyes found Margaret one last time. There was no smile now, no calculation, just rage, pure, impotent rage. Margaret watched him go and felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, just a quiet, settled certainty that this chapter was closed. She reached for Cole's hand. He squeezed it gently. "It's over," he said. "No," Margaret corrected. "It's just beginning." Their daughter was born on a cold November morning in a hospital in Denver. The labor lasted 14 hours. There were complications, bleeding, fear, moments when the doctor's face went pale and nurses ran for equipment. But Margaret had survived worse than childbirth. She'd survived Victor. When it was over, when the baby's cry filled the room, and the doctor placed the tiny red screaming bundle on Margaret's chest, Cole wept like he'd never wept before. "She's perfect," he kept saying. "She's perfect." They named her Anna, Anna Chen Brennan, a bridge between Cole's past and their future. Margaret held her daughter and thought about everything that had led to this moment. The coach that had abandoned her in the snow, the forge where Cole had found her, the evidence that had brought down an empire, the iron rose that had promised something that would last. "Look at her," she whispered to Cole. "Look at what we made." Cole kissed Margaret's forehead, then Anna's. "The best thing I ever helped create." They brought Anna home to Medicine Bow 2 weeks later. Ida had organized a welcome party. The entire town turned out. Even the people who'd been suspicious of Margaret at first had come around after the trial. She was a hero now. The Chinese woman who'd taken down a corrupt railroad baron, the immigrant who'd fought for justice. But Margaret didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a woman who'd gotten lucky, who'd had a good partner, who'd been given chances that others hadn't. The 17 families who hadn't survived to see Victor convicted haunted her still. Jonathan Whitmore's murder. Marshall Davis's convenient heart attack. The trail of bodies Victor had left behind. All the people destroyed by a system she'd helped dismantle, but only after so many had already paid the price. Their victory was real, but it was also incomplete. Justice was partial, arrived too late for too many, but it was something, and sometimes something was enough to build on. Life settled into a rhythm. Cole's business thrived. Word of his integrity had spread, and customers came from 3 counties to have work done by the blacksmith who'd stood up to a corrupt bank. Margaret opened a small accounting office in Medicine Bow, offering services to farmers and small business owners who needed help navigating contracts and loans. She taught them what she'd learned: how to read the fine print, how to spot fraud, how to protect themselves from men like Patterson and Victor. And slowly, Medicine Bow changed. The new Sheriff Dawson enforced the law fairly. The new bank president appointed by the territorial government ran an honest operation. People began to trust institutions again. 5 years passed, then 10. Anna grew up strong and curious, fascinated by both her mother's numbers and her father's forge. She learned to balance ledgers before she learned to read novels. She learned to hammer iron before she learned to sew. When she was 8, she asked Margaret about the scar on her mother's wrist, the one that looked like a letter V. Margaret hesitated, then told her daughter the truth. Not all of it. Anna was too young for the full horror, but enough. Enough so she'd understand that bad things happened to good people and that sometimes you had to fight back. "Did you win?" Anna asked. "Yes," Margaret said, "but winning cost a lot. It always does." "Was it worth it?" Margaret looked at her daughter. At Cole working in the forge, at the town outside her window thriving now healthy, at the life they'd built from ashes and iron. "Yes," she said, "it was worth it." A son came 3 years later, Samuel, named for Margaret's father. He was quieter than Anna, more thoughtful, preferring books to hammers. Margaret taught him to love learning the way her parents had taught her. 20 years passed. Anna became the first female blacksmith in Wyoming, taking over Cole's forge and expanding it into a metalworks that employed 12 people. Samuel became a lawyer specializing in immigrant rights and land disputes. Both of them carried forward the lessons their parents had taught them. Stand up, fight back. Don't accept injustice just because it's easier than resistance. Medicine Bow grew. The railroad that had once been an instrument of theft became an engine of prosperity. Immigrants arrived, Chinese families, Irish families, German families from every corner of the earth, all looking for the same thing Margaret had looked for that day she'd stepped off the coach into the blizzard. A chance. A new start. A place to belong. And Medicine Bow gave it to them. 25 years after Victor's conviction, the town held a celebration. Margaret Chen Day, they called it, a recognition of the woman who'd helped transform their community. Margaret stood on a platform in the town square, now 62 years old, her hair gone gray, her hands marked with the calluses of decades of work. Cole stood beside her, 74 now, still strong, but moving slower, his gaze still sharp and clear. The mayor gave a speech about courage and justice. Anna presented her mother with a plaque. Samuel read a proclamation from the territorial governor. But what Margaret remembered most was what happened after the official ceremony ended. One by one, people came up to her. Families she'd helped with contracts, immigrants she'd advised, children she'd tutored in mathematics. They thanked her, not for being a hero, but for being there, for staying, for building something that lasted. That night, alone in the house they'd built on the hill overlooking Medicine Bow, Margaret and Cole sat by the fire. "Do you ever regret it?" Cole asked. "Everything you went through, everything you lost?" Margaret thought about the question. She thought about the girl she'd been, terrified, broken, running. She thought about the woman she'd become, strong, rooted, fighting. "No," she said, "I don't regret it, because without all of that, I wouldn't have found you, wouldn't have found this." She gestured to the window to the town below, to the life they'd created. Cole took her hand. His fingers were gnarled now, twisted with arthritis from decades of working the forge, but his grip was still firm. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what happens after, when we're gone." Morbid thoughts for a celebration day. Practical thoughts. I want to make sure our story doesn't get lost. I want Anna and Samuel and their children to know what we did. Not because it makes us special, but because it shows them they can do hard things too. Margaret nodded. "I've been writing it down, all of it. The escape, the blizzard, the trial, everything." "Good. Stories matter. They're how we pass on what we've learned." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn low. Outside, the wind that had nearly killed Margaret 40 years ago whistled through the eaves, but inside all was warm. Cole died at 78 4 years later. It was peaceful. He went to sleep one night beside Margaret and simply didn't wake up. The doctor said his heart had finally worn out. Margaret held his hand and said goodbye to the man who'd saved her life by treating her like a person instead of a problem. The funeral was the largest Medicine Bow had ever seen. People came from 6 territories, soldiers he'd served with, customers he'd helped, families who'd been touched by his quiet integrity. Anna and Samuel buried their father on the hill behind the house overlooking the town. The headstone was simple: Cole Brennan, blacksmith, husband, father, hero. Margaret lived 7 more years. She stayed active, kept working, kept helping people. But the light had gone out of her a little. She missed Cole, missed his steadiness, missed waking up next to him and knowing she wasn't alone. On her 75th birthday, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, Margaret pulled out the iron rose Cole had forged for her half a century before. It was still perfect, still beautiful, still strong. "This is what love looks like," she told her grandchildren. "Not flowers that wilt, not promises that fade, but something forged in fire, something that lasts." 3 months later, Margaret Chen Brennan died peacefully in her sleep. Her last words spoken to Anna the night before were simple. "Tell him I'm coming. Tell him I'm ready." They buried her next to Cole on the hill. The town mourned. Newspapers across the territory ran obituaries celebrating her life. The territorial legislature passed a resolution honoring her contributions to justice and community. But the real legacy wasn't in proclamations or newspaper articles. It was in the 43 families who'd settled in Medicine Bow because Margaret had made it a place that welcomed immigrants. It was in the honest bank that served the community because she'd exposed corruption. It was in the law practice Samuel ran defending the defenseless. It was in the metalworks Anna operated employing women who'd never been given chances before. It was in the story that got passed down through generations. The story of the mail-order bride who'd been left to die in a blizzard and had instead helped build a town. The story of the blacksmith who'd chosen honor over profit. The story of 2 people who'd faced impossible odds and won not through violence or vengeance, but through evidence and integrity and refusing to give up. 50 years after Margaret's death, the Wyoming State Museum opened an exhibit on the territorial period. Centerpiece of that exhibit was an iron rose forged by a blacksmith in 1888, given to his wife as a promise. The plaque beneath it read, "The Iron Rose, created by Cole Brennan for Margaret Chen Brennan, symbol of a marriage that helped end corruption in the Wyoming Territory and established precedents for immigrant rights that would influence federal law for generations." On loan from the Brennan family collection, visitors stopped to look at it. Children pressed their faces against the glass. Teachers brought school groups to discuss the history. And sometimes, late at night, when the museum was closed, the security guards swore they could hear voices. A man and a woman talking quietly, laughing together, planning tomorrow while remembering yesterday. Just stories, the guards said. Tricks of old buildings and overactive imaginations. But maybe not. Maybe some loves are so strong they echo across time. Maybe some partnerships forge bonds that death can't break. Maybe some promises made in fire and kept through hell last longer than iron or stone or even memory. The Brennans had shown Medicine Bow that one person could make a difference, that two people working together could change the world. They'd proven that justice was worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed hopeless. That integrity mattered even when corruption was easier. That standing up to bullies and tyrants and systems of oppression was not just noble, but necessary. They'd left behind more than children or businesses or historical records. They'd left behind a lesson. You don't have to be perfect to be brave. You don't have to be fearless to fight. You just have to care enough to try. And if you're lucky enough to find a partner who'll stand beside you, who'll forge roses out of iron and promises out of determination, who'll believe in you when you can't believe in yourself, then you hold on to that person with everything you have. Because that kind of love, the kind forged in crisis and tempered by time, the kind that chooses partnership over perfection and action over fear, that kind of love can move mountains, or at least build towns in their shadow. The Iron Rose still sits in the museum today, still perfect, still beautiful, still strong, just like the love it represents, just like the legacy it honors, just like the promise it keeps even now, even after everyone who knew the Brennans personally has passed into history themselves. Some things, it turns out, really do last forever, not because they're invincible, but because they're remembered, honored, passed down from generation to generation as proof that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to accept that the world has to stay broken. Margaret Chen came to Wyoming with 23 cents and a bag full of secrets. She left behind a family, a town, and a lesson that would outlive them all. Stand up, fight back. Find someone who'll forge you roses out of iron. And never ever stop believing that one person can make a difference. Because sometimes one person can. Sometimes two people can change everything. And sometimes a love forged in a blizzard can warm the world for 100 years. The end.